Okay, hi everybody. I am Kala from Mission Citizen, and today I'm going to be teaching you all Lesson 5 of our curriculum, which covers the Judicial Branch. Okay, sorry. So, at this point, if you haven't done so already, this is a great time to go to the Mission Citizen website, so www.missioncitizen.org. Go to the Student Resources tab, go to Lesson 5, and then print out the quiz and the note sheet, and then just go ahead and fill out that quiz either based on your memory, your knowledge, or the notes that you took during Lesson 4. And once you have done that, you can unpause this video and we will go over the answers together. Okay, so for Lesson 4, for the quiz you just took, for question number 1, the president is in charge of the executive branch. For question number 2, we elect the president for 4 years. For number 3, we vote for president in the month of November. For number 4, citizens must be 18 years old to vote for president. And number 5, if the president can no longer serve, the vice president becomes president. Moving on to question number 6, if both the president and the vice president can no longer serve, then the Speaker of the House becomes president. Number 7, the president is commander-in-chief of the military. For number 8, the president has the power to sign bills into law and veto bills. Number 9, the president's cabinet advises the president. Finally, number 10, 2 cabinet positions are Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Attorney General, and Vice President. So you just need any 2 of those, and that would be a correct answer. And for question number 11, our current president is Donald Trump. For question number 12, our current vice president is Mike Pence. For number 13, the president and vice president are members of the Republican Party. Okay, now to recap the information we've been going over the last 2 weeks. So as we know, there are 3 branches of government: the legislative branch, which makes laws, the executive branch, which enforces laws, and the judicial branch, which interprets laws and settles disputes. Today we're going to go over the final of the 3 branches, which is the judicial system. Okay, so now getting into our new information about the judicial branch. As I said, the judicial branch resolves disputes and interprets laws, including the Constitution. So it can declare whether laws are constitutional, which means they follow the rules set up by the Constitution, or unconstitutional, which means they violate the rules laid out by the Constitution. The federal judiciary includes the Supreme Court and federal courts. So this is kind of what the federal court system looks like. You can see there are U.S. district courts at the bottom, and those are kind of laid out into 94 different districts across the country. They're not by state, they kind of cover various areas, and then above those courts there's the U.S. Court of Appeals. So if you don't like the way your case was decided in a district court, you can do what's called, you can appeal it to a court of appeals, which is basically just asking them to reconsider your case and potentially decide something different. And if you don't like your decision at the Court of Appeals, you can appeal it again to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court might make a different determination. And then there are also a few other courts for more specific issues, like the tax court, the claims court, and the Court of International Trade. But the court you're most likely to interact with throughout your life is probably the US district courts. And then states also have their own court systems that look a little bit different. Okay, so the Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States, and it has the final word on cases. So once a Supreme Court has ruled something on a case, there is no higher court to appeal that case to. So whatever the Supreme Court says will go, unless the Supreme Court reevaluates a similar case and comes to a different decision. So there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. The Constitution doesn't specifically state that there needs to be 9 number of justices, so this number could potentially change. But for the time being, there are 9, and it's likely that it'll stay that way in the future. So the name of the Supreme Court Chief Justice is John Roberts currently. And then there are also 8 other justices, which are called associate justices. So essentially the Chief Justice is just somebody who has a little bit more power in determining what cases the Supreme Court takes on and which justices get to write opinions on the cases and things like that. And then the rest of the judges are just associate judges. So all federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, serve for life or until they choose to retire, resign, or if they pass away, are impeached and convicted. Those are the only reasons that they would stop serving on the Supreme Court. So that's pretty different from most elected officials, which sometimes have term limits. Like the president, we know, can only serve a maximum of 8 years, but on the Supreme Court, justices are meant to do it for life. Okay, moving forward to talking a little more about the federal court system. So as I said, there are 3 levels of the federal court system: the U.S. District Court, Circuit Courts of Appeals, and the Supreme Court. District courts handle both criminal and civil trials, and circuit courts of appeals review the decisions made by district courts that have been appealed, as I said before, and there are 13 of these in the United States. Okay, so now what types of cases does the Supreme Court hear? So some cases start in the Supreme Court, including disputes between 2 or more U.S. states or disputes involving ambassadors. But these are pretty rare situations in which a case starts in the Supreme Court. So most of the time, cases come to the Supreme Court after a decision made by a lower court is appealed. And again, appeal just means somebody involved in the case asked the government, the court system, to reconsider the decision, either because there's new evidence or because they believe that it was decided wrong, something like that. So all federal and state court cases that involve federal law can be appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court only deals with federal law, though, so if it only deals with state law, it would likely be appealed to a state Supreme Court. And even though all federal and state court cases involving federal law can be appealed to the Supreme Court, it's very rare that the Supreme Court accepts one of those cases. The Supreme Court actually only accepts 1% of all the cases that basically appeal or ask to be heard by the Supreme Court. So it is a rare occurrence. They don't hear a really huge number of cases a year. Okay, so let's look at our current Supreme Court justices. So again, up here we have on the top left John Roberts, who is the Chief Justice. And there's also Clarence Thomas, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Brett Kavanaugh, who is the newest member, Samuel Alito, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Neil Gorsuch, who is the second newest member. And both Kavanaugh and Gorsuch were nominated by Trump in the past 4 years. Okay, So now that we have gone over some of the new information, we're just gonna, as always, do a quiz. So I will read the question, you can call it out, you can write it down, you can just think of it in your head, whatever you want to do. Okay, so my question is, what does the judicial branch do? If you said reviews laws, explains the laws, resolves disputes or disagreements, or decides if a law goes against the Constitution, all of those would be a correct answer. Okay, what is the highest court in the United States? The answer is the Supreme Court. How many justices are on the Supreme Court? There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Who is the Chief Justice of the United States now? It is John Roberts, or John G. Roberts Jr., if you want to say his full name. Okay, so now that we have gone over all the new information, there isn't too much information on the judicial branch that you need to know, and we're kind of at the middle point of our lessons. We're just going to go ahead and do a review of weeks 1 through 4 of this program, just so all of that information stays fresh in your mind as we continue the next 5 classes. Okay, so in the beginning of this class, we started learning about the colonies. So we learned that Native Americans lived in the colonies before European settlers arrived. Oh, and just as an aside, though you did need to be taking notes on the information in the bold before, now all of this is just information that you have already written down, so you can just be listening during this. If you would like to take notes, you can, but you can just listen and kind of let it sink into your memory. Okay, so Native Americans lived in the colonies before European settlers arrived, and settlers came to America in search of political freedom, religious freedom, and economic opportunities. While in America, settlers kidnapped Africans and sold them as slaves to make a profit in their new country. And the 13 original colonies included Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, South Carolina, North Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, and Rhode Island. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson with the purpose of declaring independence from Britain. It stated that we have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unalienable just means they can't be taken away. And the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th, 1776. And that's why we celebrate the 4th of July, our Independence Day, every year. Okay, so after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, Americans fought for independence from Britain for various reasons, including because there were high taxes and they did not have representation in British Parliament. Also because the British Army was staying in Americans' houses without their consent and something known as quartering. And finally, just because Americans wanted self-government. They no longer wanted to be ruled by an overseas power that didn't know what daily life was like for American colonists. Okay, so now let's get into George Washington, who was a key figure during the colonial era. So he led the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and he is known as the father of our country, both because of his role in the war for independence from Britain and also because he is the first president of the United States. Another key figure from that time was Benjamin Franklin. He was a U.S. diplomat and he attended the Constitutional Convention where the Constitution was written and was the oldest member there. He was also the first Postmaster General of the United States. He wrote an influential book called Poor Richard's Almanac, and he also started the first free libraries. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the framing of the Constitution. So the Founding Fathers wrote or framed the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And after that, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison wrote the Federalist Papers under the code name Publius in support of the Constitution to try to convince Americans to ratify the Constitution or to agree to put it into place. So the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, meaning that it is the highest law in this country and that all other laws must obey the Constitution and cannot contradict the Constitution. According to a concept called rule of law, everybody in this country must obey the Constitution and all other laws, including government officials. So nobody is kind of free to act in any way that they choose, regardless of whether it follows the law or not. Everybody in this country is subject to the law, even the president, even high-ranking government officials. The Constitution begins with the words, "We the people," and those three words establish this idea of self-government that the rest of the Constitution is really kind of founded upon. The idea that the people are the ones running the government, not elites, not some king in another country overseas, but the people who live here. The Constitution sets up the government and protects the rights of the people. Those are its core functions. So it basically just outlines the system of government we have and the really fundamental core rights that no law or other government action can take away from the people. So the Constitution outlines three branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, which we just talked about. And in order to prevent any one of these three branches from becoming too powerful, the Constitution includes things called checks and balances and separation of powers. Essentially, separation of powers is just the idea that each branch is given their own distinct, unique powers that the other branches don't share. And there are also ways in which each branch can ensure that other branches cannot abuse their power or act without the approval of the other branches. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little more about the legislative branch. So the federal legislature, which is known as Congress, makes federal laws. Congress has two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. There are 435 representatives in the House, and each of those representatives is elected for 2-year terms. And here in the Portland metro area, our representative is either Suzanne Bonamici or Earl Blumenauer, one or the other. All representatives represent different districts within their state rather than the whole state. So even though Oregon has 5 representatives, each individual person in Oregon only has 1, depending on the district they live in. So different states have different numbers of representatives because representatives are determined by the population. So that's part of the reason that the census, which is currently going on right now, is so important, because the census counts how many people are in each state, and based on that determines things like the number of representatives a state has in the House. So currently the Speaker of the House, or basically the leader of the House of Representatives, is Nancy Pelosi, who is in the Democratic Party. Okay, let's get into the Senate. So there are 100 senators, and we elect each of them for 6-year terms, so quite a bit longer than we elect people in the House of Representatives. Oregon senators are Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley, and because senators represent all of the people of their state rather than just one specific district, we all have the same two senators. Everybody in Oregon's senators are both Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley. So it doesn't matter where in Oregon you live. You get both of those senators representing you. Okay, the executive branch. Let's go over that real quick. So the president is in charge of the executive branch, and presidents are elected for 4-year terms, and they can serve up to 2 of those terms, so 8 years total. We vote for president in November every 4 years, and in order to vote, citizens must be 18 years old. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military and also has the power to sign or veto, which is basically like rejecting bills. Currently, our president is Donald Trump, and he is a member of the Republican Party. Okay, so the current vice president is Mike Pence, who is also a Republican. And if Donald Trump or any other president were no longer able to serve, the vice president would become president. If the vice president was no longer able to serve for whatever reason, the Speaker of the House would become president in their place. So the cabinet is a body of experts whose role is to advise the president. The cabinet includes a lot of different positions, including Secretary of Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Education, Energy, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, the Interior, Housing and Urban Development, Labor, State, Transportation, the Treasury, Veterans Affairs, and also the Attorney General and the Vice President. Okay, so the Constitution gives some powers to the national government and some powers to states. This is something that's called federalism. So basically, powers of the national, also known as the federal government, include printing money, declaring a war, creating an army, and making treaties. So only the federal government can do these things. Some powers belong solely to the states. These powers include providing education, providing protection or police, providing safety or fire departments, giving driver's licenses, and approving zoning and land use. So within states, the executive of their government is called the governor. In Oregon, our governor is Kate Brown. The US has a capitalist economic system, which is also known as a market system or a free market system. This means that American trade and industry is pretty much controlled by private institutions, not the government. Okay, well, we have come to the end of our new information on the judicial branch and our review. So now all that we have left is a quick citizen tip. So our citizen tip of this lesson is to find trustworthy news sources and also be critical of the news you read. So why is it important to be critical of the news? News sources are often biased and often portray a single viewpoint or cherry pick evidence to support a single narrative. News sources, especially TV news, can be sensationalized or dramatized to make news sound more entertaining and attract more viewers at the expense of the honest truth. Also, fake news is a relatively common phenomenon, especially on social media. Not all news that you encounter, unfortunately, will be correct. Some of it is designed to trick you, so you need to have a really critical eye to make sure that what you are reading is trustworthy and based in facts. So how do you know if a news source is trustworthy and is based in facts? A good way to know is first if the publication is well established and has a good reputation. So for example, in Oregon, one of our news sources is OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting. That is a well-established organization with a good reputation. It is known to value truth and integrity and honesty. So you can be pretty certain that you can trust what OPB says, and if they say something incorrect, you can trust that they will update their information and be honest about that. Another sign that a news source is trustworthy is if it clearly cites its sources. because this shows you both that it knows it's getting its information from sources, it's not just making information up, and you can also see what those sources are and evaluate whether they're trustworthy. Another good way to know that you can trust a news source is if it is written by qualified experts in the subject that it is writing about, or if it is citing them, because that shows you that you have reason to believe that the people writing the article would know about the subject they are talking about and that they're not just kind of making things up without evidence. Also, if the argument just makes sense given the evidence. If a news source is like twisting evidence or making conclusions that don't make sense based on the evidence, you can be pretty sure that it's not a very trustworthy news source. Additionally, articles should acknowledge and dispute other viewpoints. That way you can be sure that the person writing the article genuinely values coming to the truth instead of just, arguing one way without considering any other possible perspectives. And another good sign is if articles are updated and information is corrected when necessary, because that shows you that the publication values providing the whole truth and correcting mistakes if they do happen to make them. Okay, so finally, how to be a critical media consumer. First of all, don't get your news from Facebook or any other social media. Nobody is fact-checking it, and there aren't any standards that it has to live up to, so you just really have no way to be certain that what you're reading there is true. Also, consider who the author is when you're reading a piece of news, and consider what their potential biases and motivations will be, because that way you are less likely to be misled based on somebody's somebody who's speaking out of their own personal interest. It's also important to read beyond the headlines. Headlines are often overly dramatic and can kind of mislead you about what the contents of the article actually say. Headlines tend to be designed to get you to click on the article, but if you actually read the article, you will often find that the truth is nowhere near as dramatic or extreme as the headline made it sound. It's also important to consult a variety of sources that represent different viewpoints so that you can compare different perspectives on the evidence and come to your own conclusion rather than just believing whatever a certain author happens to be arguing. Okay, so now that we've gotten to the end of our citizen tip, I'll just let you know that if you have any questions, you can email them to us at missioncitizen@gmail.com, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. But thank you for watching this lesson. I hope you took notes, and I hope it all made sense. And email us if not.